This little move about investigating Guaido strengthens your arguments a little bit. This deal that just happened.
Oh, the arrest warrant?
Yeah.
Oh.
Investigation of the court.
The committee will come to order. Without objections, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, a record subject to the length limitation in the rules. This afternoon, the committee continues its examination of the ongoing crisis in Venezuela, with particular focus on legislation offered by a member of this committee, Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island. That bill is H.R. 1004, the Prohibiting Unauthorized Military Action in Venezuela Act. Mr. Cicilline will testify on this bill presently, then we'll welcome a second panel of experts. My position on Venezuela has been clear. I believe that the United States and our allies in the Lima Group and the European Union must continue to squeeze Nicolas Maduro and push for a peaceful democratic transition. The suffering in Venezuela is a man-made humanitarian crisis in what was once the wealthiest country in South America. The people of Venezuela deserve far better than what Mr. Maduro's dictatorship and his predecessor, Mr. Chavez, have given them. And I stand with Juan Guaido as he bravely leads his fellow citizens towards a brighter future. At the same time, we must be clear, U.S. military intervention to shape the future of Venezuela is not an option. I continue to worry about the administration's saber-rattling and constant reminders that military action remains on the table. The Lima Group, which includes Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, the EU, and even my friend, former Colombian President Alvaro Uribe, have rejected that possibility. Our former Southcom commander, Admiral James Stavridis, has written powerfully about the perils of U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. Today's hearing is to explore this issue in greater detail. Now, I've heard arguments that we in Congress shouldn't debate the use of force in Venezuela, that we should wait and see what course the President takes before we take up this issue. I disagree. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress decides whether America will go to war. Under Article 2, the President has the power to defend our country, but that's not what we're talking about here. The longer I've been in Congress, the more stronger I feel that the Congress declares whether or not we should go to war. And of course, we haven't been doing that since 1941. The Constitution and the War Powers Resolution are clear that it is our responsibility to consider the use of force before any troops are introduced into hostilities. The law requires, and I quote, the President in every possible instance shall consult with Congress before introducing United States armed forces into hostilities, unquote. And the President's obligation doesn't end with consultation. If he decides to deploy our military, he needs congressional authorization before they are introduced into hostilities. I'll be the first to admit that Congress has not done a good job in holding administrations of both parties to the letter of the law. We've handed over the keys for too long, and the executive branch has left Congress in the dust. We shouldn't stand for it anymore, and I'm not going to put off this debate a day longer. These are the gravest decisions our government must face, and we must do so only as the Constitution provides. As I've said again and again, I oppose military intervention in Venezuela. But since the administration keeps raising the possibility, I want to know what would it look like? How does the administration see this playing out? I'd like to think after our disastrous war in Iraq, we'd have learned our lesson about plunging the United States into another war without a clear path forward. And let us not forget, Venezuela is more than twice the size of Iraq. Would Maduro's colectivos join with rogue elements of the Venezuelan security forces and develop into an insurgency? What would be the impact of such a conflict be on Colombia, a country that has opened up its heart and homes to over 1 million Venezuelan migrants? Would a government that comes to power with the backing of a U.S. intervention have any legitimacy in the eyes of the Venezuelan people and other governments in the region? These questions barely scratch the surface, which is why it's so important that this committee deal with the serious and weighty concerns that accompany a military intervention before it occurs, not after it has already begun. I'd like to close with this reminder. I didn't call this hearing, and Mr. Cicilline didn't introduce his legislation as a solution in search of a problem. We have a problem when the administration keeps telling us that the use of force remains on the table. Frankly, I'd rather be focusing on how to support the people of Venezuela in their struggle for a better future. Tomorrow, we'll be considering 3 bills that would do so. But as a co-equal branch of government with key responsibilities dealing with questions of war and peace, we can't just stand here and shrug our shoulders. We can't wait for American service members to be placed in harm's way and then start to ask questions. So I hope we have an instructive discussion this afternoon. I'll now yield to our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for any opening remarks he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The situation in Venezuela is really going from bad to worse. For the past week, the country's been struggling with nationwide energy blackouts. There are shortages of food and medicine. Simply put, this is a result of Nicolas Maduro's socialist policies, criminal activity, and corruption. Over 3 million people have fled the country, with more escaping every day. Maduro has even turned his armed thugs, or colectivos, against those who are trying to deliver humanitarian aid. Our colleague and witness today, Congressman Cicilline, previously stated that the Maduro regime's corruption and negligence has devastated Venezuela's economy, starved its people, and brought the nation to the brink of collapse. I couldn't agree more. All clear-eyed and freedom-loving people around the world want to see Maduro gone so free and fair elections can be held. To make that happen, Maduro and his cronies must understand that the best outcome for them is to step down and leave the country peacefully. I know all of us want that as well. However, this legislation we are discussing today jeopardizes that outcome in several ways by appearing to take military force off the table. First, it immediately takes pressure off the regime. With punishing sanctions, a coalition of 54 countries supporting the opposition, and massive protests, Maduro is feeling the heat. We should not give him reason to breathe a sigh of relief. Second, it would put the security of Juan Guaido and his family in jeopardy, something I personally talked to the Vice President about. Maduro could easily become more aggressive in cracking down on the opposition. In fact, Ambassador Vecchio I talked to this morning told me that the Attorney General has applied for a writ in the Venezuelan Supreme Court to arrest President Guaido. This could all lead to violence and potential casualties. As I said just yesterday, the Attorney General launched a baseless investigation of Guaido for an alleged attack on the power grid. So the threat is real. We should not undermine the security of the very people we are trying to support, the people of Venezuela. Third, it sends the wrong signal to both our allies and adversaries. Without the threat of military force, it will look like we are hedging our bets. This will deflate Juan Guaido and his supporters and embolden our enemies, Russia and Cuba. This bill also plays right into Maduro's regime's strategy. Just last month, in remarks at the United Nations, Maduro's illegitimate foreign minister called on the Security Council to reject the threat of the use of force against the Venezuelan people. Finally, it will show a divided Congress, something the ambassador has warned us about. As I said, I've personally spoken with the Vice President, Special Representative Elliot Abrams, and as recent as this afternoon with the Ambassador Carlos Vecchio, who all expressed concern about discussing this bill at this critical time. They all stressed the need for bipartisan unity. Maduro's repeated mention of U.S. military intervention is simply a ploy to divide the coalition of 54 countries supporting democracy and the people of Venezuela. Opponents of this legislation are not pushing for military actions. I, for myself, am a strong believer in the sole power of Congress to declare war under Article 1 of the Constitution. I do not believe that this administration is planning to invade Venezuela. And if it did, I would be the first to push Congress to act. But this premature signal sends a dangerous message at a very delicate time. The nations that support Maduro's illegitimate regime, especially Cuba and Russia, are the very ones carrying out the real foreign intervention. As Secretary Pompeo recently stated, the United States is drawing a clear line between those who aid forces of repression and those who give life to the Venezuelan people's democratic dreams. One immediate step we can all take here today is to show our solidarity with the people of Venezuela and to directly recognize interim President Juan Guaido as a legitimate president of Venezuela, just as 54 other countries have. I strongly do and encourage my Democratic colleagues to do today as well. The people of Venezuela have suffered enough. They are finally on the verge of taking their country back. Let us not do this bill. Let us not let this bill complicate their efforts to achieve freedom from socialist tyranny and put an end to this humanitarian crisis and disaster. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCall. Let me now introduce our first witness, though he's certainly well known to all of us. David Cicilline has represented Rhode Island's 1st Congressional District in the House since 2011. He is a senior member of this committee and chairman of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law, and he is the author of H.R. 1004, the Prohibiting Unauthorized Military Action in Venezuela Act. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized to offer your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member McCall, and distinguished colleagues on this committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about my legislation, H.R. 1004, the Prohibiting Unauthorized Military Action in Venezuela Act. I appreciate the committee's willingness to take on the important issue of executive overreach in military engagement, an issue that is fundamental to the constitutional role of Congress and on which there is bipartisan agreement that Congress must take a stronger stand in ensuring appropriate consultation and oversight. As we meet here this afternoon, the people of Venezuela are suffering in darkness, literally. Millions have been without power for days. We all agree the Maduro regime has destroyed Venezuela's economy, starved its people, and engaged in widespread corruption and repression. We all agree the people of Venezuela deserve a better future, a future they determine. We all believe the Venezuelan people have a right to pick their leaders, a right Maduro has denied his people by refusing to hold free and fair elections. To be absolutely clear, Nicolas Maduro is a dictator who doesn't care about the Venezuelan people. Maduro's corrupt, kleptocratic regime has left Venezuela's economy in shambles, its people without food, and its hospitals without basic medicines. Millions have fled this despair and oppression. The people of Venezuela deserve better. They deserve a democratic future. They deserve to pick their own leaders, which is why I joined many of my colleagues in supporting the Venezuelan National Assembly's decision to choose Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. It's my hope that there will be a diplomatic solution that allows for free and fair elections in the near future, and I believe U.S. policy should be conducted with this end in mind. As the chairman said, we would not be here in considering this resolution or this legislation but for the actions and words of the Trump administration. This administration's rhetoric implying that they are willing to use military force in Venezuela is unfortunate. Not only would military intervention be illegal, it would also come with serious consequences that I fear would not only hurt the Venezuelan people, but also the prospect for democracy. Under the Constitution and War Powers Act, the president may not take unilateral military action and must consult with and receive authorization from Congress. As Special Representative Elliott Abrams confirmed when he was testifying here before this committee, the conditions for unilateral presidential military action have not been met. Congress has not declared war in Venezuela. There is not any existing statutory authorization that would allow for military intervention in Venezuela, and Venezuela has not attacked the United States, its territories, or possessions, or its armed forces. That's why I introduced this legislation, which would simply prohibit funds from being spent on any unauthorized military engagement in Venezuela. Although the administration is well aware they don't have proper authorization to engage in a military action in Venezuela, they have continued the drumbeat of aggressive, saber-rattling rhetoric promoting military intervention as an option. We know from the past that they have not seen the need to seek proper congressional approval for military intervention when they took action against the Assad regime in Syria without proper authorization. In my view, military action in Venezuela is not an option, not without congressional authorization. To be clear, nothing in this bill prevents military action against or in Venezuela or anywhere else. It simply prohibits funds to be used for unauthorized military action in Venezuela. Should the situation in Venezuela pose an imminent threat to American national security, nothing in this bill stops the administration or any administration from seeking authority from Congress for military intervention per the War Powers Act. However, without meeting the conditions under the War Powers Act, any U.S. military action with respect to Venezuela would be illegal and ill-advised. Americans do not want another foreign military engagement, and the administration has not made any case for military intervention in Venezuela. The United States must continue to work with the Lima Group, Europeans, and the international community to use diplomatic and economic tools to pressure Maduro to honor the will of his people. Humanitarian aid must be allowed into the country to aid the suffering Venezuelan people. Congress should do everything in its power to support a peaceful, truly democratic transition of power in Venezuela. The Constitution gave Congress, not the executive branch, the power to determine when the United States goes to war. And it's time we assert our constitutional duty and send a clear message that without congressional authorization, this administration or any administration cannot take the country to war unilaterally. It's also worth noting that many foreign policy experts have noted that Maduro uses the threat of military action in his propaganda campaign to try to stay in power. I'm sensitive to the arguments that my colleagues may make that the timing is sensitive and we don't want to do anything to seem like we're supporting a dictator. While I appreciate the sincerity of my colleagues' arguments, I have to say, when will the timing of military intervention not be sensitive? We are 18 years into war in Afghanistan, 16 years in Iraq, engaged in various ways in numerous engagements elsewhere, and yet Congress has never found time to reassert our control over military engagement. It's also important to note that the absence of congressional action sends its own message. The time for Congress to weigh in is now. I'm thankful to the more than 50 bipartisan co-sponsors, many of them members of this committee who are supporting this bill. I want to thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, for holding this important hearing and for considering this piece of legislation. And I look forward to the committee holding a markup and passing this legislation in the near future. And I thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline. We'll now pause to allow our second panel of witnesses to take their seats. Well, good afternoon. Let me welcome our witnesses. Dr. Rebecca Bill Chavez is a non-resident senior fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue. She previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere Affairs from 2013 until 2017. As a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Latin America, Dr. Chavez focused on supporting the Colombian Ministry of Defense's role in the FARC peace process, increasing Mexico's commitment to regional security cooperation, and shaping DoD contributions to President Obama's Central American strategy. Dr. Vanessa Newman is the founder and president of Asymmetric, hope I got that right. If I'm not, Asymmetric, whatever, a consultancy on political risk and strategies to dismantle illegal trade. She served for 4 years at the OECD, where she worked on the task force on countering illicit trade. Dr. Newman has been published in the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and is the author of the 2017 book, Blood Profits: How American Consumers Unwittingly Fund Terrorists. And to introduce our third witness, I'll yield to Mr. Espaillat of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge an 8th grade class here from Harlem Academy that I met outside of the hearing room, Mr. Chairman. I spoke to them a little bit about Venezuela, and they seem to know a little bit more than many of us here, so maybe they have a bright future. But I'm proud to introduce Professor Deborah Pearlstein, a professor of constitutional and international law at Cardoso Law School, a part of Yeshiva University, whose main campus is right in the middle of my district. A leading voice on law and counterterrorism, Professor Pearlstein has held positions at Princeton, Georgetown, and the University of Pennsylvania. She also currently serves on the editorial board of the Journal of National Security Law and Policy. Professor Pearlstein has researched, written, litigated, and advocated extensively on the human rights impact of the U.S. national security policy and U.S. detention and interrogation operations. And from 2003 to 2007, she served as the founding director of the Law and Security Program at Human Rights First. Throughout her tenure, Professor Pearlstein worked closely with members of the Defense and Intelligence Committee, including helping to bring together retired military leaders to address key policy challenges in U.S. counterterrorism operations. Thank you for your time this morning, Professor, and welcome.
Thank you. I'll now recognize our witnesses to offer their opening comments. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Chavez?
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on potential U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. And thank you also for your bipartisan commitment to maintaining focus on Venezuela and to helping resolve the crisis there. My name is Rebecca Bell Chavez. I'm a senior fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue. From 2013 until January 2017, I served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere, where I oversaw U.S. defense policy in the hemisphere. Before that, I was a tenured professor of political science at the U.S. Naval Academy. I'm deeply troubled by the humanitarian crisis and the unraveling of democracy under Nicolas Maduro, a brutal and corrupt dictator. And I want to be clear here, Maduro stands at the center of Venezuela's man-made disaster. He has followed Hugo Chávez's footsteps by systematically dismantling democratic institutions and shamelessly violating human rights. The U.S. has a role in resolving the impasse, but the question today is whether the U.S. should use military force to remove Maduro from power. My answer is no. I'll highlight two reasons for this. First, military intervention would be much more difficult than many believe. It would not be quick, and it would involve engagement with the Venezuelan military, armed civilians, and non-state actors. Second, international pressure via regional partners and European allies is one of our most important tools. We will squander that partnership if we continue to threaten military intervention, and much more so if we do intervene militarily in Venezuela. We also risk losing the trust so painstakingly built in the region over the past couple of decades. There have been many references to the 1989 invasion of Panama as a potential template. This comparison is very misguided. At the time of Operation Just Cause, Southcom was headquartered in Panama, so logistics and intel collection were relatively easy. The conflict lasted less than 2 weeks and required 24,000 U.S. troops. Venezuela is a mountainous country, twice the size of Iraq, with multiple urban centers, which would mean thousands of civilian casualties. An invasion would likely require between 100,000 and 150,000 U.S. troops, 4 to 6 times the number needed in Panama. In Panama, U.S. forces had to contend with 4,000 Panamanian combat troops. The Venezuelan military is comprised of 356,000 members. And unfortunately, defections have not been on the scale that we'd hoped. Maduro has deftly used both carrots and sticks to ensure military loyalty. Chávez's practice of purging anyone seen as a threat has continued under Maduro. On the carrot side, Maduro gave officers control over food distribution, a lucrative black market. Promotions have been given for loyalty, which is why there are over 2,000 generals in Venezuela. But the military wouldn't be the only challenge. Our troops would face an insurgency comprised of armed groups such as the violent colectivos and non-state actors with access to funding through drug trafficking, illegal mining, and extortion. Even Colombian ELN guerrillas and dissident FARC members would have incentives to join the fight. And the conflict would certainly spill over into Colombia, adding to Colombia's challenges as it struggles to implement the 2016 peace accord. Another consequence would be the unraveling of the hard-fought regional and international consensus that has marginalized Maduro. The vast majority of our partners have unequivocally stated their opposition to military intervention, including Lima Group members, Colombia, and Brazil. A military intervention would set us back at a time when China and Russia are gaining influence in the region. For these reasons, it is critical that Congress play a role in any decision to intervene militarily in Venezuela. Congressman Cicilline's proposed legislation would help accomplish that goal. Thank you again for shining a light on what's happening in Venezuela. I'd be more than happy to assist the committee as it formulates policy approaches to address the ongoing tragedy in Venezuela.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez. Ms. Perlstein.
Thank you very much.
If you can pull the mic a little closer, is button pushed?
Thank you. Is this better?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall and the members of the committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss legal issues surrounding H.R. 1004, a bill to restrict federal funding for the introduction of U.S. troops into hostilities in Venezuela. As I teach my first-year students in constitutional law, few things were as clear in the document's design as the expectation that Congress would play a central role in our democracy in defining the purpose and regulating the use of U.S. military power, most importantly when it comes to the introduction of U.S. forces into hostilities. This allocation of responsibility was made evident throughout the Constitution's text and structure and was unmistakable in the framers' intent. As James Madison put it, in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive. The trust and the temptation, Madison said, would be too great for any one man. While the past half-century or so of presidential practice has at times obscured that design, it has not changed two key propositions of constitutional law that I'd like to highlight in these few minutes. First, Congress enjoys exclusive power under the Constitution over the expenditure of federal funds. Congress holds not only sweeping spending authority under Article 1, Section 8 to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but also authority directed towards spending for the military particularly, including the power to raise and support armies and provide and maintain a navy and, of course, declare war. Of equal significance is the parallel requirement in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 9, providing that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. As reflected in these and other provisions, Congress's power in the purse is among our democracy's most fundamental checks on the exercise of executive power. H.R. 1004 is an unremarkable exercise of Congress's power in this respect under Article 1 of the Constitution. The bill as drafted is consistent with many such appropriations restrictions Congress has enacted in the past, restricting the actions of Republican and Democratic presidents alike, and is limited by its terms to preserve the United States' ability to respond in self-defense to armed attacks. Second, well, there has long been a debate among constitutional law scholars and others about the scope of the president's power under Article 2 of the Constitution to use force in the absence of congressional authorization. There is far less debate on the effect on the president's power of an express congressional prohibition. As has been clear since Justice Jackson set the framework for evaluating questions of executive power in the Steele seizure case, a framework the court, justices of both parties, continue to embrace vigorously today, the scope of the president's power under Article 2 of the Constitution depends first and foremost on the position of Congress. When the president takes steps incompatible with the expressed or implied will of Congress, whatever independent constitutional power he possesses is at its lowest ebb. At this lowest ebb, the president's claim to any power to act in the face of a congressional prohibition must be scrutinized with caution, the court wrote, for what is at stake is the equilibrium established by our constitutional system. This is an equilibrium, in my view, that ensures the President is bound by the duly enacted laws of the United States. This equilibrium is far from altered in the realm of foreign affairs. On the contrary, Congress's full engagement is critical in ensuring that the activities of America's military enjoy the full support of America's people. As the Supreme Court emphasized only recently, the executive is not free from the ordinary controls and checks of Congress merely because foreign affairs are at issue. It is not for the President alone to determine the whole content of the nation's foreign policy. While the President can rightly argue that he has the independent constitutional duty to repel sudden attacks against the United States, I do not think 1004 can be read to infringe on the President's power in this respect. The bill exempts from its coverage circumstances in which it may be necessary for the armed forces to respond to attacks on the U.S. forces or on the United States. And were there any doubt in this regard, longstanding principles of statutory construction require that a court facing a statute of ambiguous meaning prefer a reading of the statute that avoids any constitutional question. The framers knew acutely, personally, what war could cost republics. So they built in a series of hurdles. The Constitution would require Congress to publicly authorize military expenditures in the face of their constituents every 2 years. The armed forces would be manned, the idea was, by the citizen soldier, one incapable of acting inconsistent with the will of the people of which he and she were part. And a majority of the country's elected representatives would be required to approve any decision to commit the country to war. Fast forward 2 centuries, and all of those checks have been disabled. What we spend on military action is at times obscured to the public by vast sums spent on private contractors. Just 0.5% of Americans serve in the military. We're a nation, according to poll results, in which 80% of Americans support the troops. But during the height of the war in Afghanistan, 90% of Americans were unable to locate Afghanistan on a map. Today, Congress is one of the last nominally operating checks on the President's power in this regard. I'm enormously grateful for this committee's decision to engage it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Newman.
Thank you very much. There are some visuals. I don't know what the protocol is. They have been entered as exhibits. To my credentials already presented, and it's Dr. Neumann, by the way. Thank you for having me very much, members of the committee, for inviting me to testify here today, but more broadly for your concern for my beloved Venezuela. As you know, I am a Venezuelan American. I hold both passports, and I am a long-time vociferous advocate for Venezuela's return to democracy. To my credentials already presented, I would only add I am also a fellow at Yale University's Global Justice Program. My company, Asymmetrica, is part of the research network for the UN Security Council's Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. CTED, I worked a reintegration of Colombian paramilitaries in Colombia, which is why I am also the academic reviewer for a U.S. Special Operation Command's teaching manual on counterinsurgency in Colombia. My doctoral dissertation in 2004 from Columbia University was specifically about, is entitled The Autonomy and Legitimacy of States, a Critical Approach to Foreign Intervention. And it is ironic to me that it is now directly on point to my home country 15 years after its publication. In many ways, Venezuela is already suffering from war. The functions of state have been captured by a serious transnational criminal organization that provides safe haven and financing for terrorists, actively bombing their neighbors, as the ELN did a month ago to the Colombian Police Academy. It is the main transit point for cocaine into the rest of the world, destabilizing Central America and therefore our southern border, all while wresting territorial control from a legitimate government and intentionally murdering Venezuelan citizens. On February 23rd, Maduro used armed gangs to blockade the entry of humanitarian aid and shoot to kill unarmed civilians carrying food to their starving relatives. On the border with Brazil, they massacred the Pemon tribe. On March 11th, the dictator Maduro went on national television ordering armed gangs to slaughter the people. This is what 3rd Sergeant Miguel Torrosa warned us of when he crossed a bridge into Colombia on February 22nd. Maduro wants to slaughter the people, he shouted. The dictatorship certainly seems happy to let us starve and die of treatable disease. For me, the paradigmatic case is of the woman who took her 19-year-old daughter, who was dying of starvation, to a hospital that was closed because of the first night of blackouts. The child died, and she roamed the streets carrying her 19-year-old child's body that weighed 10 kilos, that's 22 pounds. It is the perfect storm of nightmares. It has worse inflation than any war zone, about to hit 10 million% in 2019, a higher infant mortality rate than Syria. More than 330,000 people have been killed by violence under the Bolivarian Revolution. 18.7 million Venezuelans are losing weight rapidly, 25 pounds in the past year. That means we are facing a massive starvation that rivals that of Ethiopia, Somalia, and Darfur, but in our hemisphere. And according to Gallup 2018 Global Law and Order, Venezuela is the least safe country in which to live. It is no wonder that Venezuelans are leaving in droves. At 3.4 million, Venezuela is the second largest refugee population in the world, second only to Syria. There are more Venezuelan refugees than South Sudanese, Somalis, or Afghans. Before the pervasive blackouts caused by the greatest kleptocracy the world has ever seen, the UN and the OAS estimated that 2 million more Venezuelans would flee this year alone, making the total refugee to 5.4 million, and Brookings and the OAS estimate that that would be 7.2 million refugees by the end of 2020. That would absolutely destabilize the entire hemisphere. Now, that was before the lights went out and before we ran out of gasoline, which is happening now. We can easily anticipate that we will skyrocket past those horrific projections. Such a massive and rapid exodus will also mean that they will destabilize the hemispheres. People will look for employment that could well be provided by the ELN, FARC, or even ISIS in Trinidad and Tobago, which has alarming rates of recruitment. And their recruitment patterns are very different from what we have seen in Europe and North Africa. They are better suited to the profiles of Venezuelan refugees. If we have learned something from our past experience with ISIS, is that when gasoline is a rare and precious commodity, as it is now becoming in Venezuela, armed groups make those forward operating bases. Venezuela has 960 political prisoners. The catastrophic state of repression and chaos is entirely predictable and part of regime policy. In the 19th century, Immanuel Kant, in his Metaphysical Elements of Justice, argued that one of the results of globalization is not just of money and information, but also of responsibility. Let us meet that responsibility, rid our region of our greatest threat, restore the dignity and freedom of millions of Venezuelans who were once our close friends. Let us find a path back to democracy in friendship and cooperation, and not hand a dictator a carte blanche for further slaughter of our only democratic forces and your friends, with a legislation that is unnecessary and serves only to plunge my people's misery in DC partisan politics. The Venezuelan crisis has been a source of bipartisan cooperation. 32 million of us need you to keep it that way. I thank the committee for its time in letting me speak here today and for its concern for Venezuela. I remain at your service as you develop policies that will be productive for both my countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neumann. Let me ask Dr. Chavez a question. Let me ask you about the position of the Colombian government on military intervention in Venezuela. Former Colombian President Alvaro Uribe, a friend with whom I worked closely when he was head of state and I was chair of the Western Hemisphere subcommittee between 2006 and 2010. President Uribe is certainly no dove. Yet he was crystal clear last month that military intervention in Venezuela must not be an option, and the current president of Colombia, Iván Duque, signed his government onto the February 25th declaration of the Lima Group, which also included major countries in the Americas like Argentina, Brazil, and Canada, stating that a transition to democracy, and I quote, must be conducted by Venezuelans themselves peacefully and within the framework of the Constitution and international law, supported by political and diplomatic means, without the use of force, unquote. My feeling is that Colombia has more at stake in the Venezuela crisis than any other country. The Colombian people have opened up their hearts and homes to over 1 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees. So let me ask you, Dr. Chavez, why do you think President Duque and former President Uribe have been so adamant in rejecting any type of military intervention in Venezuela? What is at stake for Colombia?
Thank you for the question. I think it's really important to note, as you did, that Colombia is the country, arguably the country that is most impacted by the refugee crisis in the region. I think the current number, it's at 1.2 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants are in Colombia. And as you said, President Ivan Duque, as well as former President Uribe, have unequivocally stated their opposition to military intervention. This is because military intervention in Venezuela would destabilize Colombia when it's a very precarious moment for Colombia. The low-intensity conflict that I described in my remarks and in my written statement would certainly spill over into Colombia, undermining the 2016 peace accord and the delicate DDR process. And it would make consolidation of control over the Colombian territory even more difficult. Dissident FARC members, as well as ELN guerrillas, and then there are the Bakrims, the armed criminal bands in Colombia, would likely join the struggle. I think their numbers are currently, there's 1,500 to 2,000 FARC members that have refused to disarm. They would definitely be part of this. And we have to remember that the border between the two countries, it's 1,400 miles long and it's very porous. So spillover is inevitable.
Professor Pearlstein, in your testimony, you explained why enacting H.R. 1004 would be a constitutional assertion of congressional war power. In my view, Congress's role as a check on the President's use of military force has been diminished over the years, and we are no longer really fulfilling the role the framers of the Constitution intended. Do you have any recommendations for steps Congress could take to reassert its constitutional role in decisions over America's use of military force, not just in Venezuela, but in other contexts as well?
Certainly, and thank you for the question. To be clear, I think the 1004 is supported by multiple facets of congressional power under Article 1, Section 8, not just the declare war power. But in terms of additional steps that Congress could take in this context and beyond this context to reassert its role as a co-equal branch, I think there are several. One, and this is an initiative that I know Senator Kaine has worked on and others on the Senate side, there are what he would call zombie authorizations for the use of military force, not just the 2001 authorization for the use of military force that authorized the invasion of Afghanistan, the 2002 authorization for the use of military force that authorized the initial invasion of Iraq, and there are actually a number of others on the books, authorizations that have long outlived their purpose, but are nonetheless still sitting on the books that any president might at any time invoke as a source of statutory authority for the use of force. Repealing the zombie AUMFs would be an important first step. A second step that comes to mind just this week, the president made a decision to rescind an Obama-era order that had required the reporting of civilian casualties in areas outside of active hostilities, not only casualties as a result of military activities, but CIA activities as well. Congress could easily restore those reporting requirements. Congress can frequently, and I think more frequently than it does, use the power of the purse, that is trying to do here to restrict and guide the president's exercise of authority where it does believe that the use of force is possible. And then, of course, there is the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, the statute that has now been on the books for nearly 18 years, that has justified or been used to justify now by 3 different presidents the use of military force in well over a half dozen different countries all over the world. It is possible, and there are a variety of ways to do this, to clarify, limit, sunset, and in other ways constrain the exercise of the president's authority over this way outdated authorization for the use of military force that it is, in my view, past time for Congress to revisit.
Thank you. Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just first say at the outset that I think you and I think I speak for pretty much every member of this committee, clearly believe that Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the authority to declare war. And the Founding Fathers thought that constitutional democracies would never go to war with each other, which is why they gave Congress that authority, I believe. If the President were to commit troops in Venezuela, I would be the first member to call upon you, Mr. Chairman, to hold a hearing for an authorized use of military force. But that is not where we are today. This is a premature bill that takes all options off the table. Anybody that's ever negotiated in the State Department knows that you need all options on the table to achieve results, so the diplomats can do their job. That is what the diplomats have asked of me, not only of the United States government, but the legitimate President Guaido's administration. So, Dr. Neumann, let me first say that I believe you speak for those millions of Venezuelans who are oppressed and starving and dying. I want to thank you for your courage to come forward before the Congress. President Guaido has clearly stated his support for the use of the threat of the use of military force against Maduro. I believe it's the one thing keeping him alive today. In your opinion, what impact does this debate and this legislation have on the life and safety of President Guaido and others who are risking their lives on the ground as we speak?
Thank you so much for having me again, and thank you for your kind words. I can only hope or be honored enough to represent my fellow compatriots, many of whom have, some people who are here in the audience today have been tortured by the Maduro regime. It's not for me to identify them. Those are private matters, but there are several. And I have had my own address posted online by Chavez, claiming I was out to have him assassinated. That was back in late 2011. Fortunately, he got my address wrong. After I accused them of being being in cahoots with money laundering for Hezbollah, and turned out I was right, because I then went to Lebanon to go see for myself. So the impact that it would have is terrible, because it gives Maduro something to hold up, to say that even the gringos, you know, don't agree with this, that there is division, that even within the empire, which is these are the words he likes to use, have people who side with him and see the beauty of the Bolivarian revolution. And we'll see, and for us, he would take it that he would understand that they would be entangled in domestic wranglings, and that therefore these people are thugs. All they understand is force. If they think that there is no force coming or no force possible, I firmly believe that he will view it as carte blanche to continue to slaughter us and possibly take Guaido and other people who support him and work with him. And that would be the utter devastation of the last vestige of democracy in my country. These are also some of my friends. So it is a deeply felt matter as well as a moral duty. Thank you.
Dr. Neumann, let me ask you one more question. 54 countries have now recognized the interim President Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela today. How important is it, in your opinion, that the United States Congress also make that same recognition?
It's hugely important. I actually cannot think of a way to overstate its importance, because we need the United States to stand behind us. We understand that the United States is part of a broader coalition. We want a broader coalition. It is very important. But the moral standing of the United States, it's well known that the United States has a complicated relationship with Latin America. The best book on the subject was actually written by a Venezuelan. called the love-hate relationship between Americans, the Latin Americans, the love-hate relationship with the United States. However, it has always been for a beacon of some north, and we have already been intervened and invaded. We continue to send oil to Cuba, literally over the bodies of my compatriots. So the importance of consistency and coherence and leadership by the United States, which is our north in this issue of human rights and democracy, we welcome the opportunity for the United States to take up that role and that mantle again. My own family were refugees from the Nazis and then the Soviets and into Venezuela, and now, of course, we have the Maduro regime. We have always looked to the United States for support and guidance on these moral issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neumann, for your powerful testimony.
Thank you. Mr. Cires.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our speakers today. You know, today, the Venezuelan people are suffering under authoritarian crisis caused by authoritarian leader Nicolás Maduro. Since Maduro came to power in 2013, he has consistently repressed human rights and caused an economic collapse that has left 90% of the Venezuela in poverty and forced over 3 million Venezuelans to leave the country. A week ago, I chaired a hearing in the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, Civilian Security, and Trade, examining the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. One key takeaway from our hearing was that the U.S. should follow the lead of our allies in the Lima Group in pursuing a regional solution to this crisis. After many years of disagreement, there is now consensus in the region that Maduro is an illegitimate and new elections must be called. It also came through in our hearing that the U.S. should convey solidarity with the people of Venezuela, who have shown incredible resilience in the face of a brutal authoritarian regime. I believe we in Congress should be unified in condemning the Maduro regime, expressing our full support for the interim government of Juan Guaidó and calling for free and fair election as soon as possible. It is important that while we conduct the appropriate and necessary oversight of this administration, we never lose sight of who caused the man-made crisis. I encourage my colleagues to make every effort to call out Maduro and his thugs for who they really are as we consider next steps to support the Venezuelan people. I have been following the Venezuelan issue very closely for many years, and I have seen how Maduro has repeatedly called for dialogue. Each time, he merely used it as a stalling tactic to weaken the political opposition. That said, I do not feel the military intervention is the answer to this problem. It is not the way to bring democracy back to Venezuela. The Venezuelan people and governments throughout the region have all been loud and clear in calling for a peaceful, civilian-led solution to this crisis. But in pressing for a peaceful transition to democracy, we need to be careful not to play into Maduro's tactics for self-preservation. I firmly believe that in this battle between democracy and dictatorship, we must stand on the side of the Venezuelan people who are clearly demanding change. So with this goal in mind of advancing free and fair elections in Venezuela, I want to ask Dr. Chavez, can you talk about what steps the administration could take to further coordinate its diplomatic and humanitarian responses with the allies in Latin America?
Thank you for the question. So I think you're touching on two issues that are both very important. One is the delivery of humanitarian assistance, which I will get to second. The first, though, I think is about the role of dialogue and working in a multilateral fashion. So I do agree. I think there have been, in the past, I think 3 major attempts at negotiation with Maduro, and in all cases, he used them to buy time, basically. However, I think that there is a new opportunity now with the International Contact Group, which was created in early February, to push, with the sole purpose of pushing for new elections and also for delivering humanitarian aid. It's been very active behind the scenes, act as a sort of shuttle diplomacy, discrete meetings with Maduro, with Maduro regime, with the opposition, and also with civil society members. I think we should continue to encourage that. The other thing that I think is very important about this new effort at dialogue is that it includes preconditions, which is something that the other dialogues, previous attempts, did not. You're right about the Lima group. I think we need to continue to let it take this leadership position to find diplomatic solution. And I don't think we should underestimate the fact that the Lima group actually exists and has been so outspoken and has taken a front seat, given the very hands-off approach that we saw from the Latin American countries until 2017. And I also think the OAS, under Luis Almagro's leadership, also has a lot of potential and is having impact. As far as the delivery of humanitarian assistance, I think it's very important that we, as much as we can, we depoliticize it, which would mean the U.S. and other donors at least taking a lower profile and turning to a more neutral organization such as the UN or the International Red Cross or even local NGOs that are ready and standing by to support the delivery of humanitarian assistance into the country.
My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panelists here. My notes. Dr. Chavez, what form of official government does Venezuela have that's recognized? What's the form of it? Or Dr. Pearlstein, whichever one wants to answer that. Go ahead.
So the current, under Maduro, it's not a...
No, what's it recognized as? And if you look it up, what form of government does it have?
It's a dictatorship.
It's registered as a presidential constitutional republic. Is
Right.
what it's registered as. And that's what it's recognized in the world. But as you pointed out, that's not what's being practiced, right? Were the last elections fair?
No, so first of all, Maduro was Chavez's hand-picked successor.
Okay.
In the 28.
So we're all in agreement with that. The Venezuelan government or the Constitution allows for Juan Guaido to claim the presidency, does it not? If we go by the Constitution.
So
their Constitution.
So actually, the Constitution, the Venezuelan Constitution, does not really address the possibility that something like this would happen. However, because the National Assembly is really the only legitimate democratic institution, and Juan Guaido is president of the National Assembly, it makes sense. I mean, it's appropriate that he's interim president.
Okay. Does anybody have a different opinion? Dr. Neumann?
Yes, I'm sorry. It actually is entirely foreseen in the Constitution, which was actually drafted and passed in 1999. That would be under Hugo Chavez. So Juan Guaido is the interim president of Venezuela under the Constitution that is supposed to be defended by the dictatorship. Ironically, it is the Guaido side that is defending the Constitution.
Right.
It entirely foresees that if the position is vacated because the election is not recognized, as it was not at the time by more than 60 countries in the world and the Venezuelan National Assembly, then it's vacant, and then it falls to the President of the National Assembly.
Okay.
That is written in the Constitution.
That was my understanding. We met with the Ambassador Vecchio, and we talked about that. The research I did says that there's approximately 65 countries that recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate president. That's about a third of the world's countries. You know, with 195 countries approximately, about a third of them recognize Juan Guaido. And then you have Maduro, who, as you said, is a dictator. There's roughly 33 million people. There's been blackouts. It's one of the richest countries resource-wise that they have plundered. And they've stolen over $11 billion worth of petroleum revenues from and robbed them from the Venezuelan people. So now, as you pointed out, there's a third of the population has lost over 25 pounds. There's rampant death. There's starvation. Maduro is stopping the humanitarian crisis there. And I cannot fathom this, but it's like a 1.3 million% inflation. Now, I can't imagine anything getting any worse, but if we do nothing, it will be worse. And Dr. Chavez, you were talking about, and I agree with David, my colleague here, Mr. Cicilline, about interfering in there, that it may destabilize that area. But I would argue it's destabilized now, and the 14,000 FARC members, they're going to destabilize anyways, whether we're there or not. And I agree with the sentiment that I would rather have an AUMF authorized by Congress, but to argue now at this point is going to jeopardize the legitimate president that's recognized by their Constitution in the National Assembly. And, let me ask you this. What countries are there helping Maduro? What government or other countries are helping Maduro, propping him up? Dr. Noman, you raise your hand first.
Is it like to raise my hand? Russia, Cuba, China, Iran, but all in different ways and
Turkey.
Roles.
I'm about out of time. What countries are there helping the Venezuelan people? Let me ask Ms. Pearlstein.
None, really. The
Ms.
U.S. has the
Pearlstein,
food at
how
the
about
border.
you?
That's the closest we've come.
Other than Colombia?
I'm an expert in U.S. constitutional law and international law.
Dr. Chavez, other than Colombia, is there any other countries helping them? Helping the Venezuelan people?
I mean, I think that there are 54 countries have declared their support for Guaido.
Right.
The Lima Group
but Colombia is the only one because all those people are going into Colombia right now.
Well, actually, Colombia is not the only one country that's
well, I'll take that. It's probably the largest country. The point is,
other countries have accepted, for example, 800,000. I mean, it's not. I just want to emphasize
I stand corrected.
It's not just Colombia.
And my chairman is gaveling me, so I have to stop. But I think to pull that AUMF right now is going to jeopardize the Venezuelan people, and you'll see Mr. Guaido go to prison or worse. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Yield back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to start with you, Ms. Pearlstein, as an expert in this area. I think actually in your written testimony you said there's nothing remarkable. H.R. 1004 is an unremarkable and constitutional assertion of a congressional power to restrict the introduction of U.S. armed forces into hostilities. I would normally maybe not appreciate my legislation being considered unremarkable, but I think you make a really important point that this legislation is really reflecting the constitutional requirement that before men and women of the armed forces are deployed in hostilities, that it requires congressional authorization. And the only remarkable thing, frankly, has been that it has happened so often without congressional authorization. And that's really the point to Dr. Newman's comment about it, being a partisan divide. One of the things we can do to the world is continue to act like a democracy and let people see real debate and respect for rule of law and a constitution that by its terms requires congressional action. And when a president, not a dictator is what we have in America, says he's going to use force without coming to Congress, that we ought to speak out against that. And so I just wonder if you could, if I've gotten that right.
I think you've gotten it exactly right, sir. I would just note, sort of historically, there's been this perfect catch-22 that Congress has designed to explain its inaction generally, or its lack of action generally in this area. And it's in the first hand, right? Well, it would be premature to act now because we don't want to tie the president's hands, which makes sense, but it is invariably coupled with the second part of the argument, which is once a president has acted, Congress regularly says, we don't want to act now so as to undermine the initiative of the president or undermine and indeed endanger our troops overseas. And the effect of that invariable coupling of rationales has been inaction sort of permanently. The good news is Congress is capable of sending more than one message at once, and Congress is equally capable of acting on more than one occasion as circumstances evolve. So it seems to me entirely plausible and indeed possible, based on the sort of bipartisan sense of the room, that Congress may legislate to condemn the actions of their current leader, to decry the gross violations of human rights that are going on there, and at the same time to make clear that in a democracy, we are going to follow the rule of law.
Thank you. And that is why this legislation is actually bipartisan, I think, for precisely that reason. We all acknowledge the horrors of what is happening in Venezuela. I said that during my testimony. The real question before this committee is whether or not this declaration by Congress that the use of force is not authorized without congressional action is helpful or not. And Dr. Chavez, I want to ask you, you say in your written testimony, and you said it again in your oral testimony, that we would squander the goodwill and partnership if we continue to threaten military action. Would you speak a little bit about what you mean by that? Because I've heard from a number of people that we have to be conscious of our history in the region and what we've done to repair America's standing in that region and what the repeated threats of military action might do to undermine our effectiveness as a partner.
Sure. Well, first of all, I do want to acknowledge and applaud the administration for the multilateral work that it's especially working closely with the Lima Group and the European Union. But the threats, I think, are actually, there are a number of reasons that I think they're counterproductive. One is the reason that you're referencing, that this continued saber rattling, it's going to hinder our ability to act multilaterally with our allies. It undermines the consensus. One of the beautiful things that's happened is that there is consensus. Again, this is unprecedented for such outspoken consensus in the region with the United States. And the consensus is that a negotiated solution is the best option. Things like a tweet that glorifies past military interventions. In particular, there was a tweet with images of before and after of Gaddafi. I mean, those, I think, in the region, I mean, that's meant, I guess, to kind of keep Maduro on his toes or off balance. But what that is it's seen by the region as glorifying past U.S. military interventions, which in this region is not, it doesn't go over well. The logic behind a threat is, like I said, I understand it. It's to keep Maduro off balance. We don't know.
Can I ask you one question about that? Because my time is running out. Have you seen any evidence? I've heard from a number of people about the use of this saber rattling by Maduro and by the regime as propaganda to kind of rally the country around him. That maybe you could speak to that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this plays into. I mean, these are. The tweet, for example, that was a gift to Maduro. It plays into his narrative about the United States, and it plays into the message to the entire region. It plays into his narrative or the message he's trying to convey to the rest of the region as well.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rooney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me make one thing clear. There's been a lot of talk about use of military force, but the question before the table now is whether or not to keep the option in our quiver, not whether to use military force right now. It's a major distinction. And I would say after the actions of the Attorney General and the Venezuelan Supreme Court today, if we ever needed to keep every weapon and tactic in our quiver, we need to do it right now. We're just fortunate that Mr. Guaido is still alive. I would say, thirdly, that thousands of years of human nature make it pretty clear that to take away an important weapon in a fight like this will only embolden a person like Maduro and probably, ironically enough, make it more likely that we have to use military force someday that we would otherwise not ever have to use. Elliot Abrams made it clear that none of our allies and the Lima Group, et cetera, have any problem with the fact that we've said we want to keep all options on the table. So and the last thing he said is there's no plan for military action now. With clarifying those record matters, I would like to ask Dr. Neumann, what do you think our adversaries like Russia, China, Iran, et cetera, are going to perceive were we to remove military force from our quiver of weapons?
Thank you very much. They will see it as a sign of weakness and as an exploitable weakness. So my company is called Asymmetrica because one of my other credentials is I have previously worked with the Asymmetric Warfare Group at DoD for years, in fact. So, and what you do is what we call that a vulnerability detection exercise, which the Russians are also very good at. So it's important that it be kept on the table. I want to be very clear that I agree that the discussion of intervention is entirely premature. My concern, and I am not opining on U.S. constitutional matters, my sole opinion here is that having this debate and passing this legislation significantly endangers a vast population, the last vestige of democracy, and greatly increases the odds that we will have vast terrorist recruitment and a larger conflagration in our hemisphere just a few months from now.
Thank you, Dr. Neumann. One more question, kind of the obverse of Mrs. Chavez's answer. What message would this type of legislation and the obvious reflection of divisions among the Congress send to those military officials who may be thinking of defecting from Maduro, would like to break with him, that are either too timid or too coerced or their families too coerced to do it?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so the question of military changing their mind. There are a number of things. They need, as you know, if you've also ever worked with off-ramping armed fighters, which I have, they need to believe that the exit ramp is credible and that there is a path that will entail the security and that their families won't be killed. That is one of the problems that the military commanders have in Venezuela, is that Cuban officers follow their kids to school, harass their wives as they leave their chemo treatments because they're about the last people who can get chemo treatments in Venezuela, and other such forms of harassment. And they will tell them where their relatives are. So it is the behavior of a cartel, and that's one of the issues. Removing the stick off the table, separate from American constitutional issues, will complicate the transition to a democracy, which we so desperately need.
Thank you, Dr. Norman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back, and I would just remind the gentleman that nothing in the legislation that we're currently considering takes this military option off the table. It simply requires engagement from the Congress of the United States. So with that, I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espaillat, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the panelists because all of your testimonies have been compelling, and I think they make us think about the different perspectives that are out there regarding Venezuela. And in fact, you know, there's not much of a divide here. I think there is a consensus that Maduro is a dictator. I think there's a consensus that Venezuela is facing a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented levels. I think there's a consensus that we must have free and democratic and transparent elections in Venezuela, that in fact sanctions should be applied. Even the Magnitsky Act has been applied to certain people. There is a consensus, a very large consensus here. I think the difference here is whether or not a military action should be applied. And I believe that an empty threat is not a threat at all. So unless you're willing to use military force, don't use the threat. I think the countries are far too sophisticated to understand when there is an empty threat or not. And in fact, as some of you have specified during the detailed during this panel, the region itself is very sensitive to dictators, right, first of all, from both sides, from the left and the right, and also to intervention. So the region is very sensitive and open to help because many of the countries in the regions have been under the boot of a dictator, and many of the countries in the region have also been intervened and occupied. So these are two very sensitive issues. And so what I would like to ask is something more specific. The U.S. is still purchasing oil from Venezuela. Do you think that we should stop purchasing oil? I know that there's been a reduction. Do you think that we should totally stop purchasing oil from Venezuela? First, Ms. Newman, and then anybody else that would like to.
Well, yes. I mean, I believe we stopped that, and any purchases of money now go into frozen bank accounts that cannot be controlled by Maduro. So I think that's satisfactory. I mean, that's I have no insight into whether Guaido administration has access to those bank accounts or not. I have no way of knowing, but that is good not to hand money to the dictator who is not there constitutionally and is causing the biggest humanitarian crisis in the hemisphere. So.
Now, I understand also that there is a rift between some Chavistas and the Maduro regime. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Is there any truth to that some hardcore Chavistas are also not for Maduro? Okay, please, Ms. Chavez, Dr. Chavez.
Okay.
There's historically been tension. I mean, I think you have Diosdado Cabello, who's always kind of angling in for a position. I think that there are fissures in that sense within the government. Would you agree? I mean,
yes, I would agree. So if Chavez rose as a sort of revolutionary hero with the phrase "por ahora" in 1992 when he failed in his coup attempt. So once a putschist, always a putschist, maybe, I don't know. And but he had some credibility or backing by the people as being a fighter for them. There are a lot of people who think that the Bolivarian experiment has gone off course by becoming basically a criminal organization. And by that, I mean even people who supported the movement. The other issue is that Chavez was a revolutionary fighter. Maduro is not. He's a former bus driver who has basically been trained in Cuba. So he doesn't have, and if you've worked these issues in Africa, they have similar things where, like, if you were the anti-colonialist fighter, it gives you some more public support, rather than just being viewed as a foreign puppet, which is what Maduro is.
Just one last quick question. And so, given the very fragile condition of Venezuela, and the Venezuelan people are going through hell right now, do any of you believe that a military intervention would exacerbate and maybe spiral the situation out of control into conditions that we have never ever seen in this continent?
absolutely. As I said in my written testimony, I go into great detail on this, that this would set the stage for a prolonged, low-intensity conflict. I'm as concerned about a Chavista insurgency as I am about the Venezuelan military. The number of armed groups and weapons in the country is extraordinary. I think there are 2.7 million illicit arms flowing around the country, second only to Brazil. You've got the colectivos, you've got the Bolivarian militias, you've got the special forces, the FAES. All of these groups, and the FARC and the ELN, as mentioned earlier, all of these groups have incentives, whether it be ideological or because their livelihood is tied to Chavez, to continue the struggle and to enter into a phase of guerrilla warfare. So I think it would create an extremely messy situation, and it would be prolonged, it would be ugly, there would be massive casualties. So I think the picture is very grim.
Thank you.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And one of the interesting dynamics of this particular conversation, I don't know any member of this committee, I'm not aware of any member of this committee advocating for military intervention in Venezuela. I don't know any member of this committee who believes that Congress doesn't have an important Article I responsibility here as it relates to military intervention with Venezuela. I'd be interested in knowing, any of you familiar with the 4 instruments of national power?
Well, dime
Yes.
fill, yes.
Can you explain the dime principle?
Diplomatic
Information.
Then the diplomatic information, military, economic.
Perfect.
Thank you. And then the fill is the other three, yeah.
All right, gold star. So the four instruments of national power, the Dime Principle, diplomacy, information, military, economics, and what we've seen around the globe over the course of history with our foreign policy, where the world of our military overlaps with the State Department. You could talk about the Dime Principle in North Korea, the Dime Principle in Iran, where having the M option on the table in North Korea ends up making the diplomatic effort for multilateral, bilateral diplomacy, or your efforts to ramp up the economic pressure more effective because the M is real. The intelligence on Kim Jong-un is he's known not to be homicidal, not suicidal. And where he thought that there was a possibility that the United States may actually strike North Korea, there was a dynamic that changed over the course of 2017. I think one of the main areas that, just really get to the heart of where there might be a disagreement right now is that there are many members of this committee who believe that the diplomatic, information, economic components of the Dime Principle are more effective with the M option on the table. That doesn't mean that that member is advocating for military intervention. It doesn't mean that that member is advocating against Congress's important Article I powers. But I do believe that it's very important for the military option to be on the table. But I don't want to see I don't want to see the military option actually get implemented. So it's something. I mean, it's an elephant that's in the room right now that I just wanted to get to the heart of. I do believe that this debate is very important for a future date. It's fine that we're having this conversation and we're talking about really important issues for Venezuela. There's a possibility that at some point in the future that we might be debating an authorization for the use of military force or some type of declaration of maybe it's not maybe it is Venezuela, maybe it's some other country. We don't know exactly what's ahead as it relates to that in the future. But I wouldn't want any of the points to be taken away from any members on either side of the aisle, because I think there's actually a lot more bipartisan agreement here on this issue than might manifest itself over the course of the hearing. Earlier on, there was a discussion of the Venezuelan Constitution. Article 233 has been interpreted to give Juan Guaido power in a situation such as this. It's the United States government's position to recognize Juan Guaido. And he, in the current position that he is in charge of the National Assembly, it's important for us to support Juan Guaido in that capacity. I fear for his life at this particular moment in time, and I think that in this conversation, while we debate what Congress's appropriate role is here in this particular moment, we also should find the bandwidth, we should find the room in this debate to also talk about what Congress can do to help the situation as much as possible so that that doesn't get lost. So I appreciate the chairman here right now, I guess Chairman Cicilline for the moment, for him encouraging this debate on this day. But I just wanted to share some thoughts as to why. We say we can't be silent not because we want war, but because we want to prevent it. And we should never send our troops into harm's way unless they're set up to succeed. You send our troops to succeed or you don't send them at all. There's basic principles I believe that we all would agree on. But hopefully that Congress's action as a result of this hearing is not one that takes the military option off the table, not because we want war, but because we want the diplomacy, the information effort, and the economic pressure to be as effective as possible. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from New York. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Allred, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your testimony. I read through your written testimony. I've learned a lot from it, and of course, I think this is it's very important that we are discussing this right now. You know, I'm a new member of Congress, and when I was seeking this office, I talked a lot about how things here can too simply be boiled down into black and white. This issue to me falls into a gray area. I am a civil rights lawyer, and I am very sensitive to the constitutional concerns at play with our war powers exercise and how that has been eroded over time and how Article I powers have been ignored for too long. But I'm also sensitive to some of statements that my colleagues have made here on the other side of the aisle about sending conflicting signals and trying to make sure that whatever comes out of the United States Congress is a unified message that we oppose the Maduro regime, that we support the new government under President Guaido, and that we're not going to allow this to happen in our region, in our hemisphere. So I want to try and boil down a little bit and get past kind of the caricature of, you know, Democrats are trying to do this or Republicans are trying to do that. Dr. Chavez, maybe this would be best directed to you first. What would you recommend that we do in addition to this bill that's being considered and it's being discussed to make sure that if we do take this action, that we're not sending a conflicting signal and that we are speaking with a single voice here?
I think one step would to be the formal recognition of Juan Guaido, bipartisan. I think that would be one. I think that would be relatively easy. I think that there were other things that we could do, maybe not directly related to the particular question of military intervention, but one would be, I mean, to continue to focus on the fact that there are 3.4 million refugees and migrants flowing out of the country. My question, I think an important question we should be asking is how can we as the United States help with this? And I think there are two things that we could do. One is we could contribute more to the regional response. The UN recently had a study, it was 2019, that says that it's going to require, and this is just today, and as we know, it's been referenced that the numbers are going to increase. It's about 750 million required. The U.S. has, between fiscal years 2017 and 2019, has said it's about 150 million. That's a nice start, but it's not near enough. We need to be giving more. Colombia alone is going to need $315 million. So more financial assistance to this effort. The second piece of that, I think, is extending temporary protected status to Venezuelans. I mean, what's happening now is we're asking countries of the region, we're acknowledging that they're overwhelmed. We're acknowledging that not just Colombia, but as I referenced earlier, Peru, Argentina, Chile, the islands in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago is being overwhelmed, that we extend temporary protected status to Venezuela. I think that's something that we can do. We can do it soon. I heard when Abrams said that that's something that's being under consideration. I hope it's being considered very seriously.
Thank you. I completely agree with you. And we have had a bipartisan request from some senators to extend TPS protections to Venezuelan refugees, and I would encourage members of this committee to consider that as well. My time is running out, so I want to go to you, Professor Pearlstein, and talk about the constitutional issues here. And I want to go back to law school a little bit. I'm a lawyer, and we can kind of nerd out here a little bit and go back to the steel seizure case and just ask you if this expression of Congress, how that would affect the president's ability to act under Article 2 and how that it would interact with that precedent.
Thank you. I'm delighted to nerd out on constitutional law. So let me begin by responding to that, by picking up on the point that's been made by describing what 1004 is trying to do is removing authority or taking something off the table, right? Currently, the president has no authority under the Constitution or under any source of authority statutorily to introduce forces into hostilities in Venezuela. My view is, I don't believe in a democracy. A president can credibly threaten force that he has no legal authority to use. That's the current status quo, right? That's the state of affairs if Congress does absolutely nothing here. What this does is interject and say, Congress is watching. We're not taking anything off the table, but we're saying, before you take the next step, we will specifically authorize funding, right? This is just about the money, right? And this is simply reiterating, you can't spend money we haven't given you to spend, right? I think that's the critical point here. This doesn't change the constitutional dynamic in any important way, with the exception of the steel seizure point, right? The steel seizure point, Justice Jackson's famous concurrence, says the scope of the president's power waxes and wanes as a function of what Congress does. When Congress has said nothing, right, the president is acting in effectively a constitutional twilight zone. Perhaps the president can claim power that, even though we know what the Constitution says he doesn't have, perhaps the president will have an argument there. It will depend on contemporary imponderables, in the word of the court. The president is in a different constitutional position when Congress has affirmatively said, not yet, or no. And that's the shift, that's the gear shift that this legislation would make. It would say, whatever arguments you think you have, based on past practice, are not available in the moment in which we have said, not yet.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimonies. I'd like to ask Dr. Newman, if you could, and a lot of my questions have been answered, so I do have one final that I would like to ask, and that is on the issue of war crimes or crimes against humanity indictments. I was very involved with the Court of Yugoslavia, with Slobodan Milosevic, worked very hard on that, held multiple hearings on it as well. When Rwanda and the atrocities committed there occurred, also was very supportive of the court, which was a regional court. And then David Crane, who was the chief prosecutor for the Court of Sierra Leone, I had several hearings, and he was extraordinarily effective. And Charles Taylor sits in prison today with a 50-year prison sentence, former president of Liberia, for his egregious crimes because of those prosecutions. What kind of game changer might it be if Maduro were to be indicted? You know, there is a preliminary work that's being done by the ICC. I think it's often too slow and not aggressive enough in gathering facts, but nevertheless, the chief prosecutor, Mrs. Bensouda, has gotten a referral from 6 states, beginning with Argentina, Canada, Colombia, Chile, Paraguay, and Peru. And on February 18th, announced that she has opened an independent, impartial review on the number of communications reports documenting alleged crimes falling within the jurisdiction of the ICC. And of course, you know, this isn't a panacea, but I have met with Bashir, one of the few people who met with Bashir. First thing he wants lifted from his resume is the fact that he's an indicted war criminal. He always runs the risk of being extradited. I remember we tried very hard, in the European Union especially, to get Ankara to do that when he was going to visit there. China won't do it. But that does hang over him as a kind of like a sword of Damocles. He is wanted and will be prosecuted. And people like Milosevic never thought that they would face a jury or a group of, I should say, judges. Of course, he died before a verdict was rendered in Yugoslavia. But it seems to me that the time has come, in addition to, and I do believe all cards should be on the table. I don't think intervention by the U.S., that case has been made, but it might. But I think, as you said, Dr. Newman, multilateral. I mean, we do it all the time. We empower African Union peacekeepers all the time where there's no peace to keep. They go in more as peacemakers under the guise of peacekeepers. And I was in Darfur when the first deployment was made there by peacekeepers, and there was no peace, but they were there nevertheless trying to separate the Janjaweed and others from their victims. So what would an indictment do to this situation? Do you have confidence that the ICC might be able to really take this up aggressively? One of the knocks against them is that most of the indictments that have been against sub-Saharan Africans, including the president of Kenya. So it seems to me, if Maduro doesn't fit the bill for someone who's committing atrocities, I don't know who does. So my hope is one of the messages going out of this hearing will be, let's indict Maduro. Let's let the world community bring him to The Hague and to be held accountable for these egregious crimes that he is committing every day. Dr. Newman, your thoughts?
Thank you very much. Yes, from a Venezuelan perspective, it's a real game changer for a number of reasons. As I explained before, you know, this whole concept of the Bolivarian Revolution was supposed to bring peace, justice, include marginalized populations and a greater enactment of human rights. The fact that it has gone in precisely the opposite direction, and the OAS, you'll forgive me, I don't have the numbers today, but I believe that, to hand, but it's the OAS report, which was comprehensive. I don't know, over 13,000 extrajudicial killings. It considered the use of food and privation of food as political policy, as a form of, I don't know, I think they called it a slow motion genocide. I'm not sure. They definitely called it a crime against humanity. And it's a game changer because it undermines the narrative of what these guys are about. It really presents the opportunity that he will be gone, that there is a possibility that he will face trial. It acts as a disincentive to those who support him, that you don't want to be caught up in this. I mean, you were in it either for the money or either the ideology first and then the money later, but you want to change your mind. And also quickly from a Latin American perspective, the fact that all those other Latin American countries backed the case before the ICC has never happened before in the hemisphere. So that is another signal that the countries of the hemisphere are changing in their relationship to international institutions, their views of institutional support and democracy. They want to play on the side of rule of law and be taken seriously, despite the fact that they have a complicated history with their own democratic institutions in the past. The region has been growing up, and Venezuela remains a black mark. And the ICC case is a turning point, both internally and internationally.
If I could, with your indulgence. Our other distinguished witnesses, should he be indicted? Maduro?
Could Maduro be indicted?
Should he be?
Should he be? I'm a supporter of the role of international criminal law in this role. I think the ICC is in a position to play an effective role. I think their role would be more effective with active U.S. support of international criminal law.
Well, as you know, both Republicans and Democrats have not. I mean, when President Obama had House, Senate, there was no ratification. Clinton did sign it, but there has always been opposition from the Pentagon. But that said, there could be a referral from the Security Council, so there's no doubt that is one avenue that's open even to us.
There are a
variety
variety
already
of
enough.
forms of
6
support,
countries, I think,
yes.
is enough to get the ball rolling.
Yes.
But should he be indicted, in your view?
Should the facts...
Maduro.
Yes, should the facts support it, I would absolutely support an indictment.
Based on what you know?
Based on what I know, certainly.
Yes, Dr. Chavez.
So I think that this is a question that's going to be up to the people of Venezuela. I mean, there are a lot of questions over amnesty, but there was also talk of providing Maduro some sort of off-ramp. As repugnant as that might be, there has been talk about, and I don't think we want to necessarily take that off the table either.
But sometimes an indictment sharpens the mind.
Yeah, no.
Mengistu
no.
got an off-ramp out of Ethiopia. But there was a clamor for his prosecution, not at the ICC, but elsewhere. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired, and I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me start by saying I like Congressman Smith's idea of the ICC. One small problem is that my understanding is that the administration is currently considering imposing a visa ban on ICC officials and sanctioning countries around the world that support the ICC, and that might be another direct blow to the solidarity within the region that has built up around Colombia and Venezuela, and I would hope that we would urge the administration not to go in that direction. Dr. Chavez, I want to come back to the very scary picture that you painted of potential conflict in Venezuela. Now, you painted that picture in the context of potential military intervention. But when you describe a country that contains millions of people who are armed, that is extremely polarized and factionalized, where all sides are increasingly desperate, it sounded to me like you were painting a picture of a potential conflict or civil war that could very well take place without any sort of external intervention, and I wanted you to maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
No, and I do think that you're right, and I think that the level of violence is increasing, the level of desperation of the Venezuelan people is increasing, and so I think that things could get a lot worse before they get better, which is why I think the very sad fact is that there's really no silver bullet, and perhaps that's why military intervention was considered an option, is maybe that would be something that would be quick. I think we all want something quick to stem this tide, this tragedy. I think the issue of peacekeeping came up. I could imagine at some point an international coalition, and the U.S. being part of this coalition of forces to deal with the situation in Venezuela. It's a unilateral U.S. military intervention that I'm opposed to.
Well, you just anticipated my next question, and that is precisely whether that kind of state collapse followed by an outbreak of civil war type violence in Venezuela could alter the perceptions of regional countries, the OAS, Colombia, about the need for some sort of cooperative multilateral intervention to restore peace and protect civilian life. And that does get back to the question on the table, because this resolution doesn't really differentiate between various scenarios that might arise in the future. Now, as everybody has pointed out, the resolution does not, in fact, take the threat of military intervention off the table. Legally, it does not do that. It could be perceived, though, as carrying that message, which is one reason there's been kind of confused debate about it today. Are we debating the merits of military intervention, or are we simply debating the congressional role in a decision with respect to military intervention? Is there a risk? Because, again, we have to make a decision as to what is wise here. The resolution is not compelled legally. We have an absolute legal right to pass this, but we're not compelled to. So the question is it wise? What would be, and I think we all understand threats of military intervention are unwise right now. Tweets of the sort you described, profoundly unwise. But convince me that an affirmative vote by the Congress for a resolution that could be perceived as taking the possibility of any form of military involvement, including through peacekeeping, off the table, would be wise and necessary at this point.
So what I can say to that is, I'm going to defer to the constitutional law scholar about the type of military intervention would be permissible. But what I would say is that I would not want to take a multilateral coalition-type response to what's going on off the table. Right to protect. I mean, I think it might come to that. And one thing I want to say about this is that the countries of the region of Latin America, it's often overlooked that they have great experience and know-how when it comes to peacekeeping. Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, Mexico is getting into this game. I mean, I think that if the calculus changes, that would be the way to go. As far as the legal constitutional piece, I'm not as clear on.
Thank you. My time is up, so it's up to the chairman. But if you want to address that, sure.
The gentleman's time has expired, but the witness is certainly free to answer the question.
Certainly. I think the constitutional question here is straightforward and non-complicated. To the concern that this might convey a message that Congress is not intending to convey, right? I think that's beyond my pay grade as a lawyer, but I want to make clear, right, that this is a funding restriction, and it says, by its terms, we can do this by specific statutory authorization. If this bill is coupled with some of the other measures that Congress is considering, it seems to me entirely plausible that the message sent will be one of a Congress actually seized of the issue and determined to engage.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from the state of California, Mr. Vargas, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you again, and thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for bringing H.R. 100 forward. I think it's important that we have this discussion. As I read Section 2 of it, it says, none of the funds authorized to be appropriated or otherwise made available to the Department of Defense or any other federal department or agency may be used to introduce the armed forces of the United States into hostilities with respect to Venezuela, except a declaration of war, a specific statutory authorization described in subsection B, or a national emergency created by the attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or the armed forces. So what we're debating here, this bill, is, in my opinion, what is that balance between the authority that we have as Congress and the authority the President has. Arthur Schlesinger, I believe, was the author, the historian, who said that there's the imperial presidency now, and that in the last 100 years, the presidency has grown tremendously and has usurped, in a sense, a lot of what Congress should be doing. So in my opinion, what we're doing here is debating what is that balance. And I think Dr. Prostin, you mentioned it well. I think you mentioned James Madison and quoted him saying, one person, it's not wise to have one person take us to war. Instead, it should be the community, in a sense, the representatives that make that decision. I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think it is time that we take back that responsibility. I think that we unfortunately have allowed the presidency to grow in a way that's not healthy for our country, and I think we're seeing that right now in this particular presidency, although we've seen it in other presidencies also who are Democrats, to be fair. So I think that this is very appropriate. I certainly will support it. However, I do think that what has been brought up here today, the issue of, what message do we send to Venezuela, because I think we're all in agreement, and I've listened to all the testimony here today. I mean, it's a terrible situation. It's a horrible situation. No one disagrees with that. And that Maduro is a dictator and a thug and a horrible human being, no one disagrees with that. I think we're all in agreement. It's just what role do we have to play as Congress? And I think that that's important. We need to reestablish our position. And so that's why I certainly support it. But I do have some questions, and I do want to follow up a little bit on this notion of how this will be taken in Venezuela. And Dr. Newman, maybe I'll ask you that specifically. I know you take a little bit harder line than the other two, but I would like to know how you take this, because we're not taking anything off the table. We're just simply saying you have to jump through these constitutional necessities first that are important to us. Maybe not as important to Venezuela at this moment, but important to us. But I'd like to know your opinion.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question. Yes, I am La Mujer Venezolana on the panel, and I'm thrilled to be on with two other women. But just for the record, I wanted to say that. And of course, yes, Mike, I want to be really clear. I do not want to opine on the complications of internal, domestic U.S. politics. I am a dual citizen. I am here to discuss how it would, their concerns from the Venezuelan perspective. I have, as a moral political philosopher, vastly, hundreds of pages on the importance of the rule of law.
Doctor, how will this affect the mentality in Venezuela? That's my...
The mentality is the mentality of a thug. It will be misconstrued to understand, to think that that the President Trump is hamstrung. Whether that is the intent or not, that is how it will be understood and represented by a man who has just called for the slaughter of his people by a multitude of armed groups.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Chavez, will you comment on that? Is that the way that you think that it will be understood in not only Venezuela but Latin America? I know because we do have allies here that are working with us.
So I actually think it would be welcomed by Latin America, the passage of this legislation, because I think that there have been so many mixed messages. So you have, for example, you have the tweets I referred to, or Secretary Pompeo's recent statement about the reason we're removing officials from our embassy is because we don't want to be constrained when it comes to policy responses. I think those sort of, I think having a clear message that not that we're not going to intervene militarily, but that this particular legislation shows that We're going to think this through really carefully. This is a really big decision. Congress should play its role in it.
Okay.
So
thank you. And my time is almost expired. I do want to say that I think we are out of equilibrium. The Constitution has these checks and balances, and we need to get back into that constitutional equilibrium. So I support this motion. Thank you.
I recognize Mr. Costa for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee and the witnesses. I think you've done an excellent job. The measures before us have as much to do with our own constitutional authority and the role in which Congress has abdicated part of that responsibility as it does about our policy toward Venezuela. But let me drill down on a couple of things that have been discussed here already. The policy of this administration, and I like the notion that was made a moment ago about consistency in policy. I think this administration, from my perspective, has had more difficulty being able to demonstrate consistency on a whole host of foreign policy initiatives, and I think this is but one example of that. All administrations wrestle with that, but this one seems to, when you have foreign policy by tweet, I think it's a very difficult challenge. Having said that, they have engaged in a multilateral effort here. What would the three of you comment quickly, because I have a few other questions, as to so far the policy that has been taken to embrace this multilateral effect, and what more do you think should we be doing? Dr. Chavez.
So, like I said, I applaud that we've taken this multilateral approach. I think we should continue to, first and foremost, I think just recognize the importance of the Lima Group and what it's doing, and let them take the front seat in these diplomatic.
So what more could we do?
I think we could also give the International Contact Group a chance. It's relatively new.
Do they have a timeline?
They started in early February, but they've already begun sort of the shuttle diplomacy effort. I think it's an important group also because it's a very diverse group with 8 European countries, 4 Latin American countries. So again, supporting that.
Barrister Perlstein? You're a barrister, aren't you?
Perlstein, yes. I would just make the point that multilateralism in this regard, working with regional allies, ideally working with international allies, is, depending on what's coming down the road, may be necessary from the point of view of international law to make any subsequent U.S. operation
I think we concur with you, yes.
Lawful.
So what more could we do?
What more could we do? I think the engagement of the ICC, the engagement of the UN Security Council on some sort of resolution, whether or not indeed way before.
For the off-ramp on Maduro, does the potential of an indictment help?
So there are a number of there's a range of views on this peace versus security.
You've got different options that we're discussing right now.
Right. In the range of options that are available, my impression is a credible threat of indictment, should the facts bear that out, right, can help clarify thinking well before, right? The ICC process is a long one. There's an investigation and so forth. And allowing that process to begin doesn't foreclose any options.
What would you care to add to that question about the administration's?
Thank you. The unilateral, the bipartisan acknowledgement of the Venezuelan Constitution, and that Juan Guaido is the interim president under that Constitution.
And we can do that
supporting a transition.
We can do that as a Congress.
As a Congress. There's a Congress. Support that transition. The calculus on multilateralism is going to change as the crisis deepens. So continue to develop strategies to prevent the spillover. And also, right. I believe supporting the prosecution of Maduro under RICO.
You mentioned earlier
RICO to support the Maduro indictment.
The Organization of American States. Do you think that as one of the efforts or multiple efforts that we're using to force this change, that the Organization of American States is being used effectively? Is there more that could be done?
let me say that I'm not an expert on the OAS, but obviously I've been following it. I think.
I mean, what if we
more
were
they
to call
could
a
do?
meeting
No.
for all of them to come together and to
develop a better contingency planning
policy
for the spectacular crisis that if the refugee crisis was the second in the world before, it's going to skyrocket. We need better collaboration on contingency planning.
Dr. Chavez, you look like you're anticipating an answer here.
No, so I would say the OAS has really stepped up in a way that...
Can they do more?
I think it could do more. I think that there should be more outreach. I think, for example, for Congress to more outreach to the OAS. But Luis Almagro he has been a force of nature.
my time's expired, but a number of delegates are looking at visiting in the region here in the next couple months. I'm with a group that may go to to go to Colombia. What would you advise us to do for those that are visiting the area?
I would say spend time, go to Cucuta, spend time on the border, see the magnitude of the suffering. I think you'll also be surprised by, I mentioned earlier, the importance of having a neutral party deliver humanitarian assistance. There are a lot of small local NGOs that are already there, and I think when you go to the border, you'll see whether it be Catholic relief charities or local NGOs. And also, I would recommend talking to these folks about to get a better sense of what the real challenges are when it comes to delivery of humanitarian assistance.
We'll follow up with all of you. The three of you have done a very good job. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes. One quick question, and we'll head out the door. Given the myriad of problems facing Venezuela, what should we concentrate our U.S. resources on? Economic pressure, redoubling humanitarian aid, or additional resources to help the IDPs and refugees? Starting the left, Dr. Chavez, and we'll go across the table.
Sorry. I believe that the priority must be the delivery of humanitarian assistance.
Yeah, humanitarian assistance, getting it into the country, making sure it's not part of some illicit trade, black market, or political repression. Humanitarian aid is number one.
And ideas on how do we get it past the border?
No, I think. No, I think I want to defer on that. If I were, how we get it past the border, it's going to take the involvement of multilateral groups and support from some elements either of the UN or, OAS. Unfortunately, Latin America does not have anything like the African Union. Something like that would be particularly helpful at a time like this. So forming some form of coalition and with supervision with the ICRC is really what is needed.
Any other ideas? That's the key.
One other idea, I think, is to push the UN ask the UN to push Maduro to recognize what's going on in his country and to accept aid, and for the UN to play a greater role in this particular issue.
Okay, thank you all. You guys have been fantastic. We really appreciate the briefing and look forward to keeping moving and trying to help Venezuela. Thank you. Hearing's adjourned.
Thank you, sir.